Hi guys, my name is Tanya and this is my August wrap-up. So I read 5 books in the month of August, which is basically a third of my reading for the entire year so far. So I am actually incredibly super duper happy with this, as it's a lot of progress on where I've been for the rest of the year. And I think that I'm now just over halfway towards my target of reading 30 books this year. I did take part in the Bout of Books 17 readathon from the 22nd to the 28th of August, so that spurred me on a bit, but most of the stuff that I read this month was actually completed under my own volition, which is once again pretty cool. So the 2 books that I read completely outside of the readathon were A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab and Only Ever Yours by Louise O'Neill. I started reading A Gathering of Shadows a good couple of months ago, and although I was enjoying it, I was still reading very slowly at this point, so I finally got down to it and finished it during the month of August. This was a really fun sequel to A Darker Shade of Magic, which I read last year and absolutely adored, and as those of you that have read A Darker Shade of Magic will know, the stakes towards the end of that book get very high, so this kind of pulls it back a little bit and focuses on an event in Red London called the Tuck, which is the Element Games, and it's kind of like a magical Olympics. But then that being said, the effects on characters of the events in A Darker Shade of Magic are explored in this book. So we see how Kel, Ryan and Lila move forward as characters after life-threatening and altering events. So the Element Games, or the Tuck, are incredibly fun to read about in themselves, but they also help to open up the world in which these novels are set, as the games take part between Arnesia, which is the country that Red London exists in, Faro and Vesk, which are the neighbouring countries that need to be kept at peace. And consequently this also introduces us more to the political background and the history between the 3 countries. So V.E. Schwab just really uses this to open up the whole world, which is exciting. There is also a dark thread running underneath this novel, which keeps us ticking over for the overall storyline that will ultimately culminate in the next book. So overall, as the middle book in a series, I really enjoyed this. I loved getting to explore more of the people and cultures that exist within this universe, and also whilst it took a step back, it was really good to see the character development that came from that, whilst the overarching plotline quietly carried on in readiness for the final book in the trilogy. And I rated this 5 stars. So Only Ever Yours was something completely different that was lent to me by a friend. It shows us a dystopian existence in which women are no longer born but are created as Eves. They then spend their lives until the age of 16 in a school where they're encouraged to compete against each other to become the most attractive, and knowledge-based learning is discouraged as it is seen as unattractive. When they complete their time at this school, they are divided into 3 categories. The companions, who are a select group of just 10 girls who will bear the sons for their generation's most elite males. The concubines, who are probably the largest category and are there to provide entertainment for men. And then the chastities, who are those that are deemed not attractive enough to fit into either of the other categories. And I found that this just held a magnifying glass up to our society, with girls competing for attention, tearing each other down and destroying each other behind each other's backs, all because of men. And it really highlighted the pressure that we are under and the repercussions, from eating disorders through to bullying and depression. And for these things, this was a really important novel. I did, however, find myself wanting more from the world. As it is set in a school where learning and knowledge are discouraged as unattractive, the Eves are not a reliable source of information about the surrounding world and its history. So whilst I can see why it might have been inaccurate for us to be told what was going on in this world and why it was happening, I just wanted to know more about these things and to find out more of that backstory. Also, because of the environment that they're raised in, a lot of the characters in this story are incredibly toxic, and our narrator Frida doesn't avoid this. She could be described as quite a weak character, and her involvement in all the negative talk and action of the girls is actually quite a good depiction of how easy it is to get caught up in that sort of thing, even if you don't necessarily want or mean to. So whilst we see her friend Isabel as a stronger character who has a really kind heart, it was probably actually more interesting to see this from Frida's point of view, even if that was frustrating at times. So overall, I would describe this book as very important but not perfect, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. The next 2 books that I read were completed during the Bout of Books readathon, and they were The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak and Summer Days and Summer Nights, a collection of 12 short stories edited by Stephanie Perkins. I already talked about these in my wrap-up for that event, but I just have a couple of little bits to add now. So The Book Thief completely destroyed me. I started reading it earlier on in the month, but by the time I got to the readathon I was reading it in massive 100+ page chunks and finished it quite early in the week. This follows the story of Liesel Memminger as she grows up in Nazi Germany, separated from her mother and recovering from the death of her brother. brother, and the story is narrated by Deaf, which it tells you on the back cover. It's written in a really fragmentary style and kind of jumps back and forth a bit, which was actually really good for how my brain is functioning right now, so I enjoyed this a lot. And in spite of its narrator consequently causing it to have a very deaf-centric view of the world during a time in which death was a very big thing, this book manages not to fall into any pitfalls that religion might cause for it and things like that, in spite of having to deal with religion because of its subject matter. And overall it was just a really beautiful narrative that I gave 5 stars to in the end. What I really enjoyed about Summer Days and Summer Nights was that whilst My True Love Gave to Me, the Christmas anthology, had a relative bit of diversity amongst its stories, this upped its game even further. So one of the earlier stories included a lesbian storyline. There was a story with lesbians as kind of side characters, but those also included characters of mixed races. And so because of the nature of that story, which was called Good Luck and Farewell by Brandy Colbert, we got to see different family dynamics as well, which was really interesting to experience. And Jennifer E. Smith's story, A Thousand Ways This Could All Go Wrong, features autistic characters and a main character who is learning how to be understanding and respectful of this. So I thought the way that this was written was really important. So in spite of containing some subjects that could have been handled in a very heavy-handed manner, this book was actually really cute, good fun, and I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. And the final book that I read in August was Sapphos Fables, a collection of 3 lesbian storytale novellas by Alora Bishop and Jennifer Deemer. The first of these stories is a retelling of Snow White entitled Seven, and it's told from a point of view that we're not used to in the Snow White story. This manages to deal with ideas about growing up and discovering what love is at the same time, whilst existing in a highly fantasy-based setting. And although it departs dramatically from the Snow White that we're used to, its cleverness lies in how recognisable all the elements of the original story are within it. And this was my favourite. I loved the relationship in this, and I loved the resolution of the story. Next was a Rapunzel adaptation entitled Braided. The relationship in this story was super sweet and endearing, and once again I enjoyed how the original characters were adapted to make something completely different but entirely recognisable. Final adaptation was a version of Hansel and Gretel entitled Crumbs, and this steps away from fantasy and more towards science fiction with a zombie-based plotline. Although I love the premise of this story, I really struggled with Greta, the protagonist. I think that she would have worked better in a full-length novel, but in a novella her character development had to be rushed, which was a shame. I think things would have felt a lot more organic and natural if she'd been able to grow over more time, rather than being forced to discover an entire new existence, to develop a relationship, and to realise that the world isn't necessarily what she thinks it's always going to be, all in under 60 pages. So overall I'm really glad that this was recommended to me. I enjoyed its fantasy whimsy and also its sci-fi elements, and I rated it 4 out of 5 stars overall. So those were all the books that I read in August. Let me know down below if you've read any of them, and also if you have any recommendations. And yeah, I'm hoping that September is going to be another great reading month. I hope that you're all doing really well, and I will see you very soon.